I'm Pat Thompson and I'm the Director of the Centre for Advanced Studies and also belong to the School of Education. The way this session is going to run is going to be brutally efficient, I hope. So each speaker will have 5 to 10 minutes. I'm not going to spend a long time on the introductions because you've got lots of information about people in the program. And there will be a brief pause after each speaker in case anybody has, and I will ask in fact, if anybody has a question for clarification, but we don't want to start the actual discussion until we've had all 4 speakers, and we obviously want to maximise the time that is actually available for this discussion, and I'll be kind of trying to stage manage that as best I can. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Daniele Fanelli.
Okay, what do I do here to start the slides? This? Maybe? Any?
Do you have a presentation?
Yeah. Perfect. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me here. It's a great pleasure to be in an event so unusually and interestingly organized. What you see here in the subtitle was actually part of the sort of the suggested theme for the panelists in this session, and it was circulated by email. I don't believe it's any longer in the program, but it's something I actually want to get back at the end of these very few slides which I prepared here, essentially to present some evidence, which is really what I try to make my job look like, gathering evidence around bias or misconduct or problems in science. And something that I did quite a bit was to use proxies to measure bias or bias-related patterns in the literature. And without going into the details of these different figures, what they illustrate is a pattern that I came across a few times, which is whatever I'm measuring tends to increase, moving from the physical to the biological to the social science, to behavioral studies. I found this very intriguing from the beginning, and now it's becoming more and more an interest of mine, because it recalls straight away what was suggested, in a sense, at the beginning of philosophy of science as we understand it today, in a sense. Auguste Comte, the founder and father of positive philosophy, famous polymath, presented all the disciplines, arguing that the order in which, roughly speaking, you see them here was the most natural and comprehensive. So you would start with mathematics, or if you want to be empirical, astronomy, and you would end up with sociology, the only sort of social science that existed at the time. And doing this, you would go through a series of characteristics, which are, on the one hand, of the phenomena studied. You go from very general to very particular phenomena, from very simple to very complex, but then it's also then becomes about what the science you're talking about looks like. So, famously and obviously you would start with phenomena that, being simple, can be studied with great precision, and you end up with, hence, by the way, the term exact sciences, and you would end up with, instead, disciplines which, at the time of Comte at least, could hardly be considered scientific at all. And he also, for example, discussed the issue of values, the fact that if you're doing astronomy, you're studying something that has no connection with human affairs, and moving up, you, again, cross this continuum of increasing value-ladenness. You might have noticed how no one talks about science in these terms. You can just think of any policy reports about science. In fact, most academic studies, which might have data on different disciplines, they almost never present, for example, the data in this way or discuss it in these terms. And that's because a number of philosophical conclusions made in the 20th century largely led to the demise of positivism, and hence presumably to the refutation of the hierarchy of the sciences thus conceived. But is this really the case? Now, obviously, based, for example, on the data I showed you, I believe that this is a mistake. All the more because it's not just that evidence, but for example, there is a small literature of studies that have been trying to measure the hardness of different disciplines, and the review published around 10 years ago that you see here put them all together, concluding that it would support the kind of order Comte would have suggested. Can you see here from physics to sociology? I didn't think this study was good at all, and the whole literature, I wouldn't consider it of high quality, so I did my own test of this, getting a large sample of papers and measuring a series of parameters which were just about the papers themselves, but were theoretically connected to a notion of hardness and softness, and we'll get back to that in a second, and it seems to work. Okay, you can infer this by the sort of linear trends you see in all these cases. So I truly believe there is something there to be used. At this level, you can't tell how useful it can be, but there's certainly something of the old Comtean idea, which can be updated just a little bit. For example, we shouldn't really be talking, I think, about disciplines, but more about fields of research, that is, small communities of scientists working on a specific question, a specific problem, because different questions and different problems happen to be at different levels of complexity to begin with. And as we heard before, in fact, I was happy to hear a mention already of that. I presume this is going to be one of the themes of the conference. There is a science of complexity which is still struggling to understand how to measure or understand this concept, but it is there. And that, combined with other factors, is, as Comte already argued, determining a number of characteristics of the kind of research that is done. Okay, you can talk about accuracy or the ability to accumulate knowledge, bias, which is something you have some evidence for, possibly misconduct, but the evidence there isn't broad enough. A lot of other things that we'll skip. The key concept linked to this intuitive idea, I think, that people have about hard and soft science is that of consensus. The fact that this small community of scholars is differentially able to reach agreement on what the best methods are to investigate a specific question, or how to interpret the results, and therefore whether a particular hypothesis is true or not, or whether theories are true or not.
6 minutes.
I'm done. Because how is this relevant to what we're talking about? We want to talk about limitations, uncertainties, bias, influence of values. I think these will be the main themes, or some of the themes that will be discussed in these days. Well, I think a lot of people still talk about them, about science, okay? Maybe you have a case study and then you make a point about how science and technology should address these issues. And I think that's basically where the mistake starts, because it's logical and empirically suggested that they vary by field, that is to say by research question. And it's not a variation that is completely random. It's something that can be studied, can be measured, and can be understood. And it is, as we speak, not just by me, but there is a growing field of meta-research, which started, and it probably still will flourish mostly in biomedical research, but it can be done anywhere. And if you can do this, then it means that there is no problem in principle, I believe, in talking about preventing and correcting and doing this more and more and better in different fields. And in any case, being transparent about the existence of these limitations and pointing them out. So this is where the subtitle, the suggestion made to the panelists comes in. How to maintain integrity yet provide robust knowledge and the communication of uncertainty. I don't quite think there is any tension there. No matter what maybe some philosophical developments of the last 30, 40 years might suggest, I still think that the fundamental mission of scientists is that to be transparent and be transparent about these issues and not even trusting yourself. So being as forward as possible about controlling any possible limitation or bias you might not even be aware of. And if policymakers or the public have a problem with this, well, not to be rude, but it's their problem. And the point is that they should be taught how to appreciate this transparency, how to expect it from scientists, and how to encourage it, and how to use the extra information that you get about them. And this is all I wanted to say. Thank you very much.
Are there any questions for clarification from me? Okay, we'll then move on to the next speaker, who's Professor Sheila Jasanoff.
So I didn't make PowerPoint slides because we were strictly enjoined to talk for 5 minutes, and it seemed an imposition to give you slides during a 5-minute talk. So in a way, I'm glad we started off where we did, because it points to a kind of ideal that people have about the so-called interface between science and policy, and how one should solve or balance this problem of having integrity, yet communicating uncertainty, and yet maintaining a consensus around the ways that people are proceeding. And that sort of idealized notion is somehow to get the science as purified as possible. I'm reminded of a little exchange I had with a former student who is doing part 3 of the maths tripos at Cambridge right now, and in my sign-off said, "Happy mathematizing." And he wrote back this morning saying, "Oh, mathematizing sounds so reductive. Let's say it's something about elevating thought to its purest form." So there is this urge to hardness, but anybody who's been dealing with science and technology studies over the last umpteen years is aware that what we need is not a science of complexity, but perhaps an understanding of messiness. Messiness is not the same as complexity. Complexity suggests that somehow we manage to get the pattern within the complexity right in some sense, whereas messiness suggests that there may not be such a pattern at all. So when confronted with that kind of problem, which some people want to think of as wicked, perhaps, maybe it's a good idea to go back to certain kinds of first principles. So I think that the notion that if we try hard enough, we will arrive at the position of getting the science so clear, the ways of expressing uncertainty so agreed upon, that people will just buy into that, good input, good output kind of model. I think that all of our experience, all of the case studies we know suggest otherwise. So by going back to first principles, let's figure out why we're doing this, adding science to public policy stuff anyway. And to some degree, we're doing it because we make decisions in societies that we like to think of as democratic. I'm very happy to debate that point with you, particularly coming from America these days, what that means. But anyway, there it sits as an ideal. In that world, we think that power ought not to be exercised without reason. And therefore, something about reasoning has to happen. That reasoning ought not to be arbitrary. The reason we want evidence is not because we want to fetishize a thing called evidence, but because over hundreds of years we've agreed that one way you justify decisions as not being arbitrary is to provide a thing called evidence, which is evidence because everybody agrees to take it and accept it as evidence. So we need to think how the connection of science to public policy promotes reason in some ways. All of the sociology of knowledge suggests that what's important here is the kind of collectives that you build. To some extent, reasoning is about putting the decision maker and the person into the same collective, in the sense that the public being spoken to comes to accept the reason offered by the decision maker. Why is there the kind of repudiation of Tony Blair that has existed in Britain since the public acceptance of the Iraq War? Obviously, something failed dramatically in the reasons provided. People did not agree that the kind of evidence that the Prime Minister had relied on was to be counted as evidence. It's an example of a radical breakdown in producing public reason. So good public reason requires us to get into a different kind of philosophy, not philosophy of science, but more philosophy of morality, if you will. And we need to start thinking about what goodness consists in this domain of producing science for public policy. So the thought I want to just put on the table is that in talking about that goodness, we can't afford to think about the quality of the knowledge alone. We have to think about the quality of the producer and giver of that knowledge. Who are the experts and why are they good? Is it because the science they're doing is, as my student said, elevating thought to its purest form, or are there other things involved as well? And we have to think about the mechanisms by which we provide advice, which include committees, bodies of people that come together to produce advice. And of course, we do have to continue worrying about the quality of the knowledge itself. But each of these things, the individual expert, the body of knowledge, and the collectives through which we provide knowledge into decision making, they have different standards of virtuousness, which we can talk about in more detail. One thought I would like to leave you with is that if you look at the political systems of the world, they have stressed these different kinds of virtue to quite different degrees. So as an American observer of Britain and Germany, I find that America on the whole puts much more emphasis on the quality of the expert knowledge itself. Britain, by contrast, by comparison, puts much more emphasis than American decision-making does on the integrity of the individuals who are making the decisions and producing the knowledge. And Germany, again, by comparison, puts much more emphasis on the collective decision-making body of experts that is feeding technical knowledge into decision-making. So these are some empirical findings about the ways in which actual working political systems are dealing with the messiness of producing something that I would call virtuous reason in public life. Thanks.
Do you have any questions of clarification? Okay, if not, I'll ask Dr. Beth Taylor.
Thank you. So good afternoon, everybody. The science policy interface is a very interesting place to be, and I've been very privileged to work, maybe not right at the centre of it, but certainly kind of in the periphery of the science policy interface in two different parts of my career. It's a very messy place to be, so I don't, as Sheila said, I think it's a brilliant description, and I don't have a sort of overarching theory of what the principles ought to be. So what I would like to do, just by way of introduction to this afternoon's session, is to draw on a couple of episodes from my career, if you don't mind me doing that, that I think illustrate two interesting principles relevant to that interface. The first one stems from when I worked in the nuclear industry, and I worked for the UK Atomic Energy Authority. Our biggest site by far was Dounreay on the north coast of Scotland. I don't know if anybody knows Caithness. Yeah, so it's a kind of unique place, and it's a kind of unique site. And at Dounreay, we had 11,000 tons of low-level nuclear waste sitting in a so-called repository, but so close to the sea because it had been built there in the 1960s that you could see in 200-300 years' time the sea was going to erode into where the low-level waste was stored, and it would just get disseminated in the Pentland Firth. So generally speaking, not a good solution. And then there's a huge, big policy question. What do we do about this? The real options, well, there was a do-nothing option, but I don't think anyone would have seen that as justifiable. Neither of the real options was very desirable. They both involved digging this up, which exposed these workers, of course, to radiation in the process and to just general hazards of workplace life. And then rebuilding a facility in the north of Scotland, next door, basically, but further inland, or shipping the whole lot south to Sellafield, where it could join a much bigger UK repository. So how on earth does anybody make that decision? And that is fraught, as you can imagine, with all sorts of Scotland versus the rest of the UK issues, as well as just the sheer unpleasantness of this decision. But it's a decision that had to be taken. The waste existed, something had to be done with it. Hugely impressed by what sounds like a very nerdy methodology. But the Scottish Environment Protection Agency, and I'm sure the Environment Agency in England does this too, required us to do what they called a best practicable environmental options study. So it's a terrible mouthful, and I'm sorry about that. What it meant, though, was complete separation of the facts, the scientific facts, from the decision-making process. And that's my thesis today, really, is that that is terribly important. One has to inform the other, but you mustn't conflate the two. So basically, for the best practical, I'll call it a BPEO process, you have to identify what are the impacts that your different courses, your different options are going to have, what amount of radiation are people going to be exposed to, how much traffic is going to be going up and down the roads, what's the impact on local jobs, what's the impact on the local economy if it's trying to be a tourist economy. So a range of different impacts. First you have to decide what those impacts are, then you have to amass the facts on them. But for many of them, that evidence will be quite factual. I mean, obviously, it's subject to some uncertainties, but it's pretty well defined. And then the real question is, what do people feel about the balance between these different issues? So do you care more about lorries going up and down the road than you care about having low-level but radioactive material in your backyard? Do you care more about expending vast sums of public money to create a new facility compared to the impact on local jobs for the future? And that was a great process because what we had to do was bring together lots of smallish groups, focus groups, I suppose, from the local community, representing different interests, farmers, fishermen, crofters, people working in the plant, people from further away who felt they were affected by what happened in the plant. Sit them down with the project managers who had done the work to put together the facts and go through the evaluation process. And to me, that had two huge advantages. One was that it kept the facts as facts. The local community weren't there arguing about, oh, you've got this wrong. They were there saying, well, what does that mean for me? And it also actually brought the two sets of people together. So project managers from the plant who might have thought the local community were a bit silly and misinterpreted things and didn't understand the need to get on and do stuff. People from outside who thought, ooh, they're the atomics in the plant and we don't trust a thing they say. And actually just sitting down in the same room with a common basis of facts to discuss was a fabulous process. And the reason I'm so keen on this is because if you look at one of the huge issues that we've all got to face in the science policy interface at the moment, which is climate change and how people interpret that and what we do about it in terms of spending money on abatement policies, I think that's got exactly the problem that this little nerdy process managed to avoid, which is conflating the evidence with the decision. I don't think it's illegitimate at all of the people who are what you might call climate skeptics to say, I've seen the evidence, but I think it's not worth spending the money, I will carry on doing what I do. But what I really resent at the moment is that they don't do that. They say, oh, I don't believe the evidence, so I will rubbish it. I will collect more evidence from people who I know will agree with me. But they're not honest enough to make the decision based on fairly firm evidence. Maybe I'll bring my other thing up in the course of the discussion. Okay? Thank you very much, everyone.
Do you have any questions? Oh, you're all being very good. The speakers have been very good as well. I'll now call on Dr. Chris Tyler.
Thanks. Hi. So for those of you who don't know the Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology, which is the bit in Parliament I run, we provide science advice supporting, well, we talk about science in sort of the way that government does, meaning the natural sciences, engineering, and the social sciences to an extent as well, but excluding economics, because that's the dark arts, so we don't go there. And our job is to support parliamentarians' use of those research evidences across both the House of Commons and the House of Lords. So everything I say today really has that as a backdrop, the fact that I'm working in Parliament as opposed to government, and I'm an active science advisor in my day-to-day job. So what I wanted to talk about today, three very quick things. One, why we do science advice. The second is how we should be doing science advice. And then as a practitioner, the third thing is what I feel I'm missing in terms of knowledge about science advice. I guess the first thing to say is that interest in the relationship between science and policy is growing alarmingly. When I first got into this game nearly 10 years ago, it was really small fry. I mean, there was a little bit of interest. There was certainly some interest academically, but it was extremely niche. And there did exist science advisory structures, but it was all very kind of low key. Now we see big research programs, for example, the one here that is funding this conference around science policy. There are new departments springing up in the University of Cambridge, Centre for Science and Policy, which I used to run, and in UCL, Science, Technology, Engineering and Public Policy, which Brian Collins set up, our first speaker today. A rapidly growing department, that one. I mean, 7 months ago, it was just Brian and one other guy. It's now 32 people. It's growing at an extraordinary rate, and I think that's characteristic of this enthusiastic interest, in this growing interest in science and policy. Another area that's really grown is the profession of science advice in itself. It is now a profession in its own right. There are people like myself who have really started out in some sort of science advisory role and are building a career in that sort of bridging role between the academic world and the policy world. People like me don't see ourselves as a policymaker or an academic. I see myself as some kind of weird morph in between the two, with a foot in both camp. And yeah, I've worked in the University of Cambridge, but I certainly had one foot in policy, and now I'm working in Parliament, but I certainly have one foot in academia. And that science advisory infrastructure that's growing in government and through Parliament internationally, not just in the UK, is well worth recognising. So why are we doing? So how should we be doing this science advice? Well, I thought about some of the reasons I've heard some of my colleagues give for doing science advice, and I've heard some shockingly bad answers in my time. I remember one person telling me that the reason he did science advice was because it was his job. Well, that's a bit miserable, isn't it? Great, it's your job, but why does that job exist? Another one that I've heard is because politicians are ignorant. Well, some are, true, but there are an awful lot who aren't. And one thing we know from the social sciences is that providing advice to ignorant people doesn't get you very far. You'd be much better off seeking out the people who aren't ignorant, in inverted commas, and providing advice to them and really trying to work with people to help them make better decisions. Another one, this is the most common response, is because policy should be evidence-based. Now, while that's true to an extent, very few people would say, no, we don't want our policy to be evidence-based. Evidence is one part of any policy decision-making process. It's not the whole thing. And 9 times out of 10, when I hear from a scientist that they think that policy should be evidence-based and that this one wasn't evidence-based, 9 times out of 10, what they mean was, I disagree with that policy decision, and I have selected some evidence that agrees with my position. Now, we all do that. We're all subject to cognitive biases. Scientists are no different from politicians in that respect. But what professional policymakers have to do is build in the evidence alongside all the other things that matter, like law, like economics, like the fact that we're never building a policy from scratch. There's always some kind of precedent, some kind of framework within which you're having to work. And, of course, public opinion matters enormously too, and I'm sure we could talk about some examples there later. So my answer when I'm asked, why do you do science advice, is simply that I want to help policymakers, and in my case, politicians, I want to help them make better decisions. That's it. That's the ball game. It's not just about me fiercely wanting to get the science into the debate. It's that I want them to make better decisions. Now, there's no such thing as a perfect policy decision. Somebody's always going to lose out. Somebody's always going to win. What you're trying to do is seek that, given the information that you have, and frequently we're dealing with a scenario where you have, on the one hand, far too much information, the human brain can't possibly take it all in and make a decision on its own, on the sheer wealth of information out there. And at the same time, incomplete information. There's never complete information to help make these policy decisions. So our job as science advisors is trying to help those people making decisions, on the one hand, wade through this enormous quantity of evidence and help them find some rational way of arriving towards a conclusion. And at the same time, helping them deal with the fact that there's a whole bunch of stuff we don't know. Brian earlier alluded to the famous Donald Rumsfeld quote about known knowns and known unknowns and all that malarkey. The unknown bit of what he said, that is certainly very much in the domain of science advice, helping politicians, in my case, understand the stuff we don't even know that we don't know, that kind of uncertainty. But the vast bulk of what we do was in the fourth category that Rumsfeld didn't cover, which is the stuff that we know, but for some reason we don't know. Yeah? He talked about, just so I get this the right way round, I'll read it. He talked about known knowns and known unknowns, but what we're trying to do is help with the known unknowns. We need to where there's information missing, make people aware of it, and we need to do so in a way where that information fits into the policy context rather than standing alone on the outside. No problem, I'm almost done. Right, so what am I missing as a policymaker, as someone involved in the policy process? Well, it's ironic that the very people like myself who are involved at the science policy interface and advocating the use of evidence are operating in something of an evidence vacuum ourselves. It's remarkable how little we know about the science policy relationship. There is academic research that takes place, and a lot of that academic research is absolutely fantastic. But the bulk of it is either the bulk of it is in government agencies, those kinds of places, and virtually none of it looks at Parliament, the bit I'm interested in. And given that so many of us live in parliamentary democracies, it seems to me that we're missing a big area of interest where we're just talking about Parliament. We need to look at the legislatures as well and how they work. And the other thing is that a lot of the academic research tends to be just very academic. It's quite hard to apply an awful lot of that research, or we don't have the time to kind of package it up and apply it to the practice of providing policy advice. So I just wanted to raise those two concerns I have, because it's one of the reasons that in Post we set up a research programme there looking at how evidence is used in Parliament, how it's being used in parliamentary debate, parliamentary scrutiny, and in making legislation. That's not really been done, but it's not been done before at all. And with ESRC funding in partnership with UCL, we are conducting this big evaluation program over the next 2 years. And if there's another one of these conferences in a year or two, I'd like to come back and share some of those results with you.
Does anybody have any questions or clarification? Okay, we're now going to open it up to you. Because we're recording, it's going to be important that you actually wait and get the microphone so that what you say can be recorded. Secondly, when you speak, if you could say your name, you can add any other kind of short extraneous details you want to, like where you're from and what your field is, but it would be very helpful if you could say whether your question is for the whole panel or for a particular person on the panel, so that we know where it's directed. So, who's going to go first? 1, 2.
Thank you very much for these interesting expositions. You have put various questions on the table, and I hope that we get to some answers during the discussion. First of all, I noted an interesting contrast between what Sheila said and Beth Taylor in terms of the evidence base which we should have in order to make sound policies. Sheila started by saying there is this ideal that the sciences should be as purified as possible to have a good policy decision, whereas Beth said this is exactly what we need, and didn't seem to see that as an ideal only, but something that can be achieved in practice, and if I interpret the case correctly, was achieved in practice. So establish the evidence first and then develop policies based on it, but don't mingle both up, because this will contaminate both sides and lead to unpleasant controversies, and the example was climate change. So I wondered if we take that further, how do you review that with regard to concrete examples, and what do you think is a realistic conclusion with regard to that important question? And related to that, and I think that applies probably to all of you, various times you mentioned something like good expertise, what makes a good expert, what is a good decision. So how do you define good decision, good expertise, good science? What are the parameters to make a judgment here?
Would you just say your name just for the record?
Rainer Grundmann.
Okay, over to you, panel. Do you want to anyone want to go first, or do you just want to line up?
So I don't think that's one question. I think that's lots. And I suppose, just thinking about how you finished, I think you were asking about what makes good science or good evidence and what makes a good decision. I'm not sure about the good decision. I think I would say for the good science, I think it's key that it's done in as much depth as time permits, and I completely understand there will be some decisions where you can only do so much research. If you think back to the foot and mouth disease outbreak in 2001, where obviously people were amassing evidence and having to make decisions. I was going to say on the hoof, I'm not sure that's a very good analogy, but you know what I mean. Then you can only collect as much evidence as you can. It's obviously good if you've got scientific research in the bank that you can draw on to bring that out, but in terms of exactly what's going on the ground, you've got a certain amount of time. So what you can do is limited. On the whole, some of the biggest decisions don't have to be made at such short notice, and therefore I think there's a duty on people to amass as much research as they can. Big question is, who pays for and presents that research? Because in the end, the people who have to make a decision on it, or the public who have to form an opinion on it, actually have to trust the research. And I think that's a real difficult issue and a big argument for government funding for research as opposed to private companies who, however altruistic they may actually be, you're always going to kind of believe that they've got some motivation in funding that particular kind of research. Sorry, I'm waffling a little bit. So basically, for the research, I think I'm just saying as much good science as clearly unbiased and with no possibility of being biased as possible. And in the end, it's down to how much you trust what's being presented. Good decision making, I might cop out and leave to somebody else, I think, because that is very, very difficult. And I suppose I'd fall back on a kind of just common sense view, which is when a decision is really difficult, it probably means that there's not a huge advantage on one side or the other. And what you actually want is someone to have the courage to come down on one side. And that is very hard to do. And if you think about the London Airport debate at the moment, everybody knows we need another London Airport. There's tons of evidence about the impact on the communities round and about. But no political party is going to want to make that decision. It's too scary.
So, Rainer, thanks for pointing out that contradiction. If there's one message that I would like the room to take away at the end of the conference, it is that we have talked about producing knowledge in an unbiased way, separate from politics and apart from decision making for far too long. This is not the way we should talk. I would be far more worried about Beth if she actually believed and practiced what she says she does. But if you think about the example she gave about nuclear power and Scotland, her story was replete with conversations between the people who were doing the technical stuff and various interests that just kept coming in and out of the story. So there is no way to do science for public purposes without politicizing the terrain on which science is being done in the first place. Which question are you trying to answer? Is it about lorries, or is it about the expense to government of creating the single nuclear repository, or is it about the dangers of having, several thousand open, surface storage points scattered across a nation? We've been debating this for a very long time, and I think that if you followed something like the 30 plus years of the Yucca Mountain controversy in America, you realize that this is an ongoing, braided set of issues where knowledge advances, people's understanding of their states in the matter advance, and people's understanding of what may have been wrong with the initial framing of the problems also advances. In this whole sort of debate about nuclear waste and nuclear power and safety, there are some initial choices being made that could not get brought out into the public domain without having a more democratic set of debates about what is at issue. This is what made the National Academy of Sciences of the United States not known as a body that thinks science is politics, but is the National Academy is quite pure sciencey. But in 1996, that Academy produced a report that said that in public decision making that involves science for public policy, we need a thing called the analytic deliberative model. That was fancy talk for saying that sometimes we need analysis, sometimes we need deliberation. This has to be recursive. It always has to be like a ping pong game. It has to go back and forth, because we cannot do the science without being sure that the framing of the policy issues is what people actually want, and that part is always going to be political. So I think we need to complicate our understanding of what this interface stuff is about, and I don't think that the linearity of doing the science and keeping it unbiased, then getting it into politics and values, serves us well at this point. Be it noted, it is exactly the rhetoric adopted by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, And you can just, as a 25-year case study, ask how successful has it been in quelling controversy about climate change. The IPCC takes as its ethos that they're going to be policy informative, but not policy determinative. So they make that boundary. Is climate change today a more or less controversial issue than it was when the IPCC got going? And if your answer to that is it is more controversial, then you should step back and ask whether that underlying model makes sense or not, or whether the IPCC should have engaged with the world polity in a different set of debates that would have brought to the forefront some of the politics that must be involved in any efforts to do with climate change, regardless of how solid certain findings about climate change may be or may not be. So I think that this is a place where there actually is a great deal of social science research. It needs to be taken seriously, and I think we need to change the discourse on this issue once and for all.
Okay, Zika. Okay, with all due respect, the position just exposed is exactly, and the climate change case is perfect to illustrate where I believe the problem is. I obviously agree with what Dr. Taylor said, that no matter how difficult it is, that is the objective, to try to keep the facts distinct from the political decisions to begin with. Where I would disagree, for example, with what Dr. Taylor exposed is precisely the concept that, for example, in the case of climate change, you have a field which is climate science, which is where I think, the mistake was just being made. There is no such thing. When you talk about this issue, you're talking about a constellation of research questions which address different aspects of the problem and different phenomena. And just to map the basic ones, you obviously have the physics of climate change. Then you have the understanding of how those play out in the long run on the climate itself. Then you would have the impact that these changes would have on a biological level, physiological or ecological, ethological. And on top of that, then you have the social and economic consequences, which are the ultimate element on which a policy should be decided. It's crazy to consider this one field which it's either biased or not, and you end up, unfortunately, characterizing it, but on both sides, as it's us against them. You have two sides, the evangelists and the skeptics, and they're each accusing the other of being bots or fraudulent. And that's exactly where the mistake begins. And just to cut short, it sounds a very complex question to ask what is good science and what is good policy making, but it isn't, I think. It's about transparency. The whole mission of science, and it's a very difficult one, is that of overcoming one's and humanity's limitations in terms of cognitive abilities and physical and energy limitations. And so more than anything, for one thing, it's a collective enterprise. And good science is science that operates in all manners possible to overcome those limitations. You do that on yourself. When we think about good science, we think about a scientist being very precise and objective. But that's in fact just a part of the story. The real story is you have a collective whose job should be to criticize each other and replicate each other's findings and keep them in check, because you contrast yourself as a human being when you're a scientist, or in fact when you're not as well. So that's where good science comes in. Good policy decisions, I think it was mentioned by Dr. Taylor already, and that you have to be transparent about that. In climate change, okay, be transparent about what you can actually tell with certainty and where there is still a level of debate. And by the way, talking about precision is not just about uncertainty, but it's also about the sizes of the effect, the magnitudes of the effects you're looking at, how strong those are, how important are these effects you're talking about. And you do that, and then you make it clear that if we want action, we're going to take this action, and this is a political decision, which hopefully will be a democratically supported one. But that's all, and that's my naive answer, I guess, to your question.
In the interest in keeping this lively, I disagree with virtually everything that was said in that.
The idea that you can
separate facts from policy is just complete nonsense. There's just no way. The values that are being asked in conducting research are dictated by societal norms and the policies, etc., that we live in. They're just simply not separate. Obviously, yes, there are some places where you can say, look, we tested this and we think it's more X than B, X than Y, or we looked at this objective thing and we come up with an answer. But the vast majority of science advice is not taking place in black and white. You're not looking at black and white answers. I agree completely with what Sheila was saying on that in that respect. Secondly, economics isn't the only thing. There are plenty of other things that are really important. I'll come back to that in a second. And thirdly, transparency, again, is not the be-all and end-all with this. You simply cannot make complex policy with 100% transparency and expect to get anything done. It's just not going to happen in the real world of politics, okay? So coming back to this question, the central question that you asked is how do you make a good decision? What is a good decision, okay? When I'm dealing with this and I'm talking with politicians, okay, the first thing is you have to understand that it all depends on your values, okay? Where a particular politician might be coming from. But once you've kind of worked that out, what you're looking for is a solution to a problem, something that actually works. You say, what is it you want to achieve with this particular policy? Will the decision that you've taken get you there? Either this year, next year, or in 5 years' time, 20 years' time. Will the decisions you make today get you to some kind of end game? Right, that's the most important thing. Second consideration, which is also really important, is it going to do more good than harm? You're going to harm somewhere. There's no such thing as a perfect policy. You're going to do some kind of damage somewhere. The question is, can you do more good than harm? And that depends on a lot of other factors. Okay, alongside that, you cannot make these decisions with politicians without realising that whether or not that decision is popular is critical. They are voted in after all. And you can't expect people you can't expect turkeys to vote for Christmas. What you can expect politicians to do is say, there's one or two things upon which I'm going to stake my reputation, and I'm going to go and I'm going to be unpopular. You brought up Tony Blair with Iraq War. The guy stuck his neck out on that one. He knew it was unpopular when he made the decision. There were millions of people marching against it, and he still made the decision. And then he still got voted in the next time. He burned up a hell of a lot of political capital, but there are topics on which some politicians, maybe one or two topics on which they do get to stick their neck out. But popularity is really important. And the other thing is politically viable. Is in a political system, whatever it may be, one party, two party, three party, etc., how politically viable is something that you want to do. All of those factors have to be built into whether or not it's a good decision.
Could I offer a very quick footnote to what Chris just said?
Sure.
I heard David King talk about foot and mouth disease. The reason I bring this up is that you mentioned it as an example, and it's a perfect illustration of everything you just said. He said that at some point he went to Tony Blair. By the way, the problem with Tony Blair was not sticking his neck out. It was whether he did it on the basis of a lie or on the basis of...
Well, that was the problem as it transpired, but you can't deny he didn't stick his neck out.
No, but as long as one is talking about the facts. But in any case, David King showed us at this public meeting, with, I have to say, refreshing honesty, a graph that showed how quickly the disease could be brought under control with different levels of containment. I mean, so if you killed just the herd that was infected, or if you went to the neighboring 10 farms, or if you went to the neighboring 60 farms around that, and he plotted that against the election timeline. And he showed it to the Prime Minister and asked the Prime Minister how quickly he would like this line brought down in relation to when the next election was going to be. And King turned to the audience and said, "What do you think the Prime Minister chose?"
He moved the election, as it happens, didn't he? That's what happened.
Yes.
I'd like to just come back, if I may, because I do feel slightly got at. Because, and I know I started with a very little example, because it's what I know, it's an example I lived with. But I just think it's got lessons for bigger examples, and the reason I think it's got lessons is because it worked. So I think we've got a little confusion here. I know there's an ongoing angst about higher level waste and what the hell we're going to do with it, and that's a very reasonable question. This was a specific issue, but a big issue for the locality and for Scotland. The conclusion that the local community came to was, we'll build a repository here. That's what the government backed, and it's currently being built. And I see that as, without enormous controversy around, and I see that as a real success for what could have been a very controversial issue. So, cards on the table, I know it's not a big deal, but because it's my little deal, I think it could be a great example for some of the bigger deals that we can't manage to deal with.
Okay, I'm going to stop the panel there. I'm sure, Ronnie, that was a great question.
Was that one?
No, we've got another one at the back. Anybody else going to? Okay, 1, 2, 3. He's probably going to sing us out. Okay.
Hi, my name's John Turney. I'm a science writer. A question for Chris, I think, but I'll steal a moment before that for a comment that comes up from what we just heard, which is simply that the statement, everyone knows we need another London airport, strikes me anyway as deeply political, not factual in any sense. Question, it's sort of historicising it a bit. I was interested in your perception that you're part of a growth industry, all these science policy helpers, helping people make better decisions. And I recognise the signs that you point to. I can remember meeting, I guess in the 1980s, a man called Jack Gibbons, who was then running the Office of Technology Assessment in the States. It was then at the height of its influence, perhaps, and employed about 200 people producing reports on just about every issue that any of us might be interested in. The subsequent US administration took a value-based decision that they didn't really want that kind of advice, and the Office of Technology Assessment went away. It was shut down completely. So my question would be, do we now have, do you think, maybe a step change which is irreversible, or is this simply a fashion in decision-making which might, again, go out of fashion?
OST is a really interesting example, and there are people there who were there at the time who could, OTA, who would be much better at describing what happened to me. I mean, it's interesting because Post exists because of OTA. 3 MPs weren't happy with the science response they were getting from House of Commons officials at the time on the science questions. They went over to the US, found the OTA, came back and said, we want one of those, please. Parliament said, hell no, we're not setting up one of those. So they decided to set up a charity. One of the people they went to ask for money was Margaret Thatcher, who apparently said this was a terrific idea, reached into her handbag, wrote out a cheque for £100 and said, wave this around in your fundraising, it might help. It did, they set up Post, and the rest is history. We then got subsequently brought into Parliament and so on. What's interesting about OTA is that talking to the people who were there, they said it was a political decision, not a decision to get rid of science advice per se. There was a fair amount of horse trading. And actually quite a lot of the function that was in OTA, which I think is fair to say was overly big, was moved across into the US equivalent of the National Audit Office called the GAO, Government Audit Office over there, which doesn't actually do government, it does legislature. So some of that function does exist. There's a network around the world based around of parliamentary technology assessment units, 17 in all, the core of which are in Europe to various European parliaments at international, national and subnational levels. Though overall the number of people involved in those exercises are growing over the last sort of 10 years rather than shrinking. The same is certainly true in UK government over that sort of 10-year period as well. Whether or not it will start shrinking, I don't want to predict, but I would not bet that it would shrink. I would bet that it would continue to grow, because making good policy is a difficult thing. The role that evidence can play in that is getting better understood and getting more and more traction at political levels, and I can't see that function isn't going to increase over time.
So you're saying there's a growth area for PhDs?
Yeah.
Delighted to hear that, one of the few down the front here.
Hi, my name's Dara O'Hare. I'm Communications Manager for the Children of the 90s Research Project at the University of Bristol. So we're a long-term health research project that's been charting the lives of thousands of... my question is for Chris, really, but others may want to come in as well. So we produce a lot of public health research which has policy implications. We're working very hard to try and get our senior academics engaged with the process. We've already done some work with Post, but we are coming up against some barriers that maybe other people have experienced as well. So some of the issues that come up are some of our academics are, they would describe themselves politely, I suppose, as research purists. You know, they're working in a field that's so specialised and rarefied that no one else could possibly understand, particularly not the layperson, so only their other peers would understand it. I think they also think that there are teams and teams of people, little sort of policy elves who run between universities and Parliament, sort of acting as mediators, and that is somehow someone else's job to do this. I think they're also concerned that whatever the resulting policy might be that they might be involved in, that they may not like it, and they're not used to that lack of control over published material. And I think for some, I think they see the process of engaging with policymakers as being intrinsically political in some way or another, and that could somehow stigmatise them among their academic peers or funders. So it's really a very practical question. Any top tips you've got for overcoming some of those barriers and getting academics to engage with policy people?
It's a great question, and having worked in a university, I recognise all of those problems plus a few others. I wouldn't profess to be able to come up with any kind of list of quick go-tos where you're going to walk away today and say, right, problem fixed, chaps. It's not going to happen. This is an unfair generalisation, but I reckon around a third of academics are really kind of naturally good communicators to such an extent that they can just walk into a policy domain without knowing that much about it and be really effective. Around a third can be taught to do that stuff, and a third I wouldn't let anywhere near policy at all, ever. The purists, some of the purists that you're thinking of might fit into that latter camp. And I don't think we should be forcing academics who don't want to engage. I think it is important that the people who do want to engage are given the space to do that. And yes, I recognise that there's some stigmatisation associated with that, but university leadership needs to step up and do something about that. Remember Alec Browers, now Lord Browers, when he got offered the job of chief scientist at one of the departments, I can't remember which one it was now. He went to it wasn't Alec Browers was vice chancellor at Cambridge at the time, and Frank Kelly had just been offered the job of CSA at Department of Transport, and he went to Alec and said, I've just been offered this gig in government. I'm really worried that people are going to hate me for taking it, and I'm really worried that it's going to impact my research. And Alec apparently looked him straight in the eye and said, if you don't take the job, I'll sack you. And we need more Alex in this world, I think, in academia. The long-term future for getting this right is that we need to make policy part of the training for people going into academia. Every single person who goes through a PhD should have some kind of very basic understanding of how policy works and why what they do as a profession is important to people who are involved in policy, why it's important for society. And then people should have add-on training as they get in further down the academic channel, where they have the option to go and spend time in policy working. We take around 30 PhD students a year into Parliament for 3 months at a time, with funding that we take from research councils, professional learning societies, and so on. So we're doing a little bit that we can do, but there's a lot more that can be done, and I think the research community needs to look to that.
Daniele?
I think the training scientists and making them understand how policies work, if they also inclined, I think that's absolutely a good idea. What is not a good idea, for example, is telling them or stressing the point that scientific objectivity is a myth after all, or that having evidence-based policy, genuinely evidence-based policies is a myth. Because if you do that, definitely at least the purists you're losing, and I think that's what really you don't want to lose, and what you're going to have as engaging scientists are, excuse me the term, but the cynical ones that don't even believe they're actually doing science, they're doing politics to begin with. And, you know, that's dangerous and to be avoided at all costs. So the purists are not, the purists should be preserved and encouraged. That's what I would say.
Didn't mean to interrupt. Are you saying that we should tell people that evidence-based policy is achievable in all circumstances?
That if you want to work with scientists who believe in science, this is the kind of terms in which the dialogue should be happening. That you're aiming to the objective of making the best decisions based, to the extent possible, on the best evidence. If you're telling a different story, I completely understand why the purists don't want to even bother.
But that isn't the case. So does that meet your transparency agenda?
But this is what you, yeah, well, I mean, sorry, say that again.
But it's not the case that everything's going to be evidence-based. It's the case that it's much more complicated than that. So why would we tell a bunch of people?
Well, to say the least, assuming what you say is completely true, and I think you might be overstating the case a bit, as Dr. Taylor illustrated with her own experience. But even assuming that's the true, you're describing things as they are, not as they should be.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm sorry, but then are we doing politics to make the world better, or are we just being cynical and just trying to manipulate public opinion or politicians to our own, desired outcomes? Because this is what saying that you can't separate decisions from science sounds like to me. Manipulation.
I'd just like to come in because I think we've got slightly, I like to think we've got slightly confused. I think there's a distinction between evidence-based policies, which I absolutely think is what we ought to be aiming for, and policies that are just based on evidence, which I agree with Chris is never going to be achievable, because there's lots of other factors that the decision makers will have to take into account. But for goodness sake, surely, Chris, even you would agree, that we should make sure the evidence bit of what they're basing their policies on is as good as could be, but not kid ourselves that they're not also going to take lots of other factors into account with that, and that's their prerogative.
Is it people's prerogative in this day and age to ignore the fact that knowledge has a sociology to it, and that there is a study of how things get to be called things like evidence? You're suggesting that Chris has made an is-ought confusion, but is it more confusing to say that to take things as you think they should be and describe them as if that is how they are? Because one could take a lot of the discussion that's been going on this side of the table to some extent as that. To clear up a few things, Beth, it's absolutely, your Scottish example is relevant to be read in the right ways. The question is, who's doing the reading, and are you extracting from your Scottish case the same lessons that I would extract? And the answer is no. That's the point, not whether the case is important and significant or not. Is it significant as an example of how the separation of facts from values led to the right result? Or is it significant because there was, through procedural devices, a kind of relatively good mixing of facts and values, such that the community came away satisfied that there was a good answer at the end? And I think that is a real question. I don't know enough about the facts of your case to be able to say that I would read it this way or that way, but my hypothesis going in would be that there was a merger of facts and values and not a separation, which is why it came out in the robust way that you describe it as having come out. Secondly, who gets to read and who gets to teach and so on and so forth is very important. And even with all due respect to you, Chris, you're going and asking a bunch of people in OTA, why did you get dissolved? It's just an input to a study. That is not the interpretive outcome that one would necessarily want. If you want to look at American politics as a sort of contextual background for this, OTA was trying to be a relatively apolitical body sitting inside one of the most politicized bodies in the world. That experiment did not work. It's actually a good case study in the same way that the IPCC is a good case study. And it got dissolved not because its functions got split up and put into GAO and the Congressional Research Service. The argument was made that we didn't need OTA, but the fact is that people also said that OTA's apolitical judgments were not very relevant to policy making, that they arrived too late in the day, that their timeline for doing policy studies was too long in relation to when Congress had to act, and moreover, this was the year of Newt Gingrich and the comeback of the Republican right. So, it is true that politics engulfed the OTA, but it's also true that OTA was trying to carve out a kind of intellectually untenable space, given the institutional context that it was sitting in. And I think that those kinds of, that's part of your complexity, right? One has to read the cases against the backdrop of that complexity. And I think that this whole question of how one interprets cases and who is in a better or worse position to interpret our experience is something we have to take in hand, and is something itself that I think requires further analysis. It's not clear to me that philosophy of science is the ultimate authority on reading those kinds of complexities.
Well, with all due respect, the sociology of scientific knowledge isn't the answer either. Mind you, I'm not saying that there aren't cases where it's very difficult or even impossible to tell apart facts from values, but those, for one thing, happen to be very often in the social sciences or in those high levels phenomena, pass me the case, which are very different from establishing whether, what the impact of having trucks coming back and forth is. You can get solid numbers there, and there is a level where the decision becomes political, and that's where, again, you can be transparent about that. I'm just going to say, you lose people, and I think you would lose credibility in the eyes of the public if you seriously made claims such as, we say it's evidence-based, but it's all political anyway to begin with.
Okay, as you can all see, I'm sure, watching the clock, there is, there's no more time for questions or comments at all. I think following chairs will have to potentially think about the format and how to actually allow more of you to ask questions, because I know there are about another dozen people that were really frustrated that they couldn't ask their question, and my apologies for that. But to complete this session, will you join with me in thanking our speakers for opening the debate in indeed a very lively and robust way. Thank you.